Let's start with some introductions while you introduce yourselves on the chat. As I said, my name is Mark Reed. I'm a Professor of Socio-Technical Innovation at Newcastle University. This is a Research England funded chair through N8 Agri-Food. And I do research in environmental governance, but alongside that, for the last decade or two, I have done research on impact, trying to understand what works, what doesn't work. And based on that, I wrote my book, the Research Impact Handbook, and I do training through my company, Fast Track Impact. But most recently, I've been working with Bella, and we're going to be focusing today on the most recent paper that we've written. Bella, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Bella, and I'm a PhD student at Newcastle University. That's one of my many identities, working with Mark and two other supervisors on an analysis of REF 2014 case studies. You probably know this already about me, given that you've read Mark's email inviting you to this webinar. I also have another role at Newcastle University. I teach English for academic purposes, mainly to international students. What's happening with that sector, who knows? And I'm also, my third relevant identity here is that I do case study reviews for some of you. I recognize some names, and I can see some people in the audience here who I've worked with already. So great to see you again here. And I might say more about that later on, but just to reassure you, this is not a sales pitch, just to contextualize this a little bit, and why I'm saying the things I will be saying in a moment. Yeah, I'm a linguist by trade.
Fantastic. So let's dive into this. As I share my screen, it's nice to see so many people here, almost 200, and from all over the country. We also have a couple of people from outside the country. We've got someone from Galway in Ireland, someone from Groningen in the Netherlands and elsewhere, from PhD students to professors, professional services staff, and more. So wonderful to have you all here. So I'm going to start by giving you one slide, which is my summary of everything you need to know about impact in REF 2021. I'm not going to go through this in any depth because it is all publicly available. It is also, I would argue, fairly boring. I think of particular interest to many of us is the implicit announcement yesterday from Research England that it is highly likely the window for recording impacts, so for the window within which impacts have to occur is highly likely to be extended to the end of December 2020. This is inferred from the consultation questionnaire, which gives us two questions, one of which is on the length of the window, and it simply asks, should it be a blanket extension for all case studies until the end of the year, or should that be on a case-by-case basis? So no guarantees yet, but it looks like the announcement is going to be, we'll get an extension till the end of the year, which I think is good news for all of us who at least have excuses for extending if those excuses are needed. If you want to read more about this, you can go to my website where you can see at the top here a 2-minute summary, a longer summary of everything from the guidance and my latest REF intelligence, which includes an extended list of indicators being used by universities around the UK to demonstrate research quality. But lots more, including the paper, the slides, and this webinar recording will also be up here probably by tomorrow. I'm going to start by getting some engagement from you guys, and just a wee test. I've never done this at scale before, but I wonder, do you believe what Research England have been telling us fairly consistently, option 4 in this case, that the criteria have not changed? This is still essentially attribution, significance, and reach. And therefore, if you submit a case study that is worth 4-star, that was worth 4-star in 2014, then you will get 4-star in 2021. There are very few people I know who do take that at face value, but I wonder to what extent as a group we believe that, or think that no, in fact the bar has been raised. It will be harder to get 4-star in REF 2021. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to continue voting. I'll wait till we've got more than 50%, which we have. And there is a fairly clear winner right from the outset, which is the answer probably, followed in close second by definitely. So I concur with you, and interestingly, although we haven't had anything official from Research England, Stephen Hill answered a question from me in a public setting and said that he too didn't believe this. And the reason he gave for this was that there's evidence from the panel reports from 2014 that a quite substantial number of case studies found themselves between 3 and 4 star. And by and large, the panels graded them up to 4 star. And his view is that it is likely that they will grade them down to 3 star this time round. Of course, that means that if you're looking at what you think is a definite 4 star, then that may well not be definite. It may be that this time round, something of the same quality would actually have been graded down to 3 star. So let's take that assumption as a starting place and then ask ourselves, well, if the bar has indeed raised, then how has it raised? And in a word, it has been raised in relation to evidence. We are at a sector now evidencing research impact case studies way better than we did in Ref 2014. In particular, we've got longer term evidence. Partly that's because we started collecting the evidence earlier, but we've also thought a bit harder about how we can collect, follow up, even longitudinal data, getting permission to follow people up over time. And we're being much more careful about establishing cause and effect relationships along causal chains. And of course, the longer your causal chain, the more hard it is to prove that, yeah, that impact ultimately was in some shape or form linked to this piece of research. And of course, your claim is only going to ever be as strong as the weakest link in that causal chain. Linked to this, one of the things that we're also doing better is testimonials. There were a number of opinion-based testimonials last time round, and this time round we're told that these need to be evidence-based. But how do you collect an evidence-based testimonial? And how do you avoid what I'm calling testimonial carnage? And there really is quite a lot of carnage out there at the moment. At this point in the REF cycle, everyone is trying to get testimonials. And of course, the situation of the coronavirus making this fairly challenging for some of us. But the problem is that you don't know how that email is going to land. And a lot of misunderstandings and broken trust arising from people who thought that you were doing this in the public interest and because you cared about them, who now begin to suspect a conflict of interests. That, yeah, maybe this was actually all about personal or institutional glory or promotion, or that possible £650,000 price ticket on a REF impact case study. And questions, perhaps rightly, being asked as a result. Also, when we do this via email, very often the results we get are just not worth the paper they're written on. We're struggling to understand what impact is half the time, and well, yeah, great, I've got something on paper, but actually it doesn't really do the job. So my suggestion is instead that we do evidence-based testimonial interviews. Now, I'm going to record this, so I'm going to get ethics approval, I'm going to get informed consent. You can download my consent form from my blog on Fast Track Impact if you want to adapt this for your own purposes. And now I'm asking for a part catch-up and find out if I can help you any further. And so, yeah, this could be involving some more work, that's fine, but I'm aware of that. And of course, this makes it easier for me to ask. I don't feel this is so extractive because I'm offering something back. So you get over that embarrassment of asking for a testimonial. But in the second half, I'm going to ask some questions. And the questions are essentially the REF criteria: significance, reach, and, well, was it me? Could it have been someone else? And to what extent was this our research? And finally, an ethics check. What could we have done better? Are there things that went bad, that went wrong, that we could have done differently, perhaps? And now, hopefully, through these questions, I really get to the nub of this. So this is really what happens, and I now transcribe that. I highlight the relevant bits that really get to the nub of this, and I ask now, can you write a testimonial based on the highlighted text, which is easier for them, or I write that testimonial for them, but as far as possible in their own words, based again on that highlighted text, and I send them a transcript so they can see. Now, we do need this on letter-headed paper. One problem I've had is people saying, I'm working from home, so I don't have access to this stuff. So worst case scenario, if you don't get this on letter-headed paper, then if nothing else, you've got a signed bit of paper that says, yes, you can use this for ref, and I'm still going to be able to quote it. The example you can see here is from my own impact case study, and this was 10 minutes of glory I got with someone at the climate conference in Madrid. And when I spoke to her, she said that, yeah, we've got this £10 million that came as a result of work that I'd done. Instantly, I'm thinking, well, 10 million, is that significant enough? So I'm asking some additional questions. And okay, so in context now, £10 million that in the context of an austerity budget where DEFRA's budget was getting hacked is quite impressive. And this is the first time that they've had a budget like this. Great, some context now makes that a bit more impressive. She then said this was evidence based on another policy mechanism. So they use evidence from the Peatland Code to get the money through. I was then able to remind her, so yeah, do you remember my role in that? And I was like, yeah, that was based on your research, wasn't it? Great. So would you mind saying something along those lines as well? Yeah, of course. And now we've got something that links back to my research. I put a year in there because I did move to Newcastle in 2017, so I'm anchoring it in the right part of my contract. And we've got now a synthetic quote developed from that testimonial interview that does everything that we're looking for, at least I'm looking for anyway. So an example of what you can get via an interview that is, I would argue, superior, but also safer in terms of avoiding misunderstandings and conflicts of interests than trying to collect testimonials via email. I'm going to stop at this point and hand over to Bella. And at this point, we're going to dive into her research with myself, colleagues from Northumbria and Leeds as well, from professional services, and co-supervisors from Newcastle. Bella, what made a 4-star ref impact case study in 2014? What can we learn from this to write a 4-star case study in 2021?
As I said earlier, I'm a linguist, and as such, my research is about the language in ref impact case studies. And the data available to me when I started this project was the 2014 case studies, which, as you're probably aware, are publicly available through this database. And on that basis, we did 2 studies, which we've published in this article. I posted the link to the article in the chat, but maybe Mark, you might want to kind of repost it just now. Some of you may have already seen the article or dipped into it. If you haven't, consider downloading it now just to kind of refer to it if you want to. I'm giving you a quick tour through some parts of it and referring you to places in the article where you can get more information on what on the points I'm raising. So we did these 2 studies which we published. One was a linguistic analysis and one a thematic analysis. We compared 2 specific groups of text, the high and the low scoring case studies, 4-star on the one hand and 1 or 2-star on the other hand. We identified 124 high scoring and 93 low scoring case studies in those units of assessments where we could also find high scoring ones. And in table 2 in this article, there's an overview of which units of assessments are represented in our sample, in case that's of interest to you. For the linguistic analysis, I only looked at the text sections 1, 2, and 4, and ignored those sections that are basically reference lists. And 2 main research questions here were which 2, 3, and 4 word combinations appear more frequently in high or low scoring case studies, And a second one is about readability. Is there a difference in how easy to read those case studies are? The thematic analysis, we had a slightly smaller sample because it was more time consuming to analyze the case studies. The sample is mostly overlapping with the linguistic sample, so we've got the same distinction. Again, the samples in table 2. We had an agreed set of questions that we tried to answer for each case study. The questions are also listed in the article, and 6 of us, as Mark outlined earlier, did this analysis. And I will highlight 3 of our main findings in the next couple of minutes. One is that highly rated case studies provided specific, high magnitude, and well-evidenced articulations of significance and reach. So from the qualitative analysis, we found that the vast majority of high-scoring case studies articulated significant and far-reaching benefits, compared to only about 1/3 of the low-scoring case studies, which in turn typically focused on pathways to impact rather than the impact themselves. In table 4 in the article, we've got loads of examples of how this significance and reach is evidenced both in high and low scoring case studies. So there's this comparison of what seems to have been convincing evidence for the ref panel back then and what seems to have been viewed as weak evidence.
To summarize then, this first finding is that basically you had to do what you were asked to do. And the key thing here is that we're giving specific and high magnitude articulations with evidence that we've got significance and reach. And by contrast, the low scoring ones talk about their pathways instead. So the number 1 cause of low score, I'm going to suggest, is people who inadvertently submitted their pathway by mistake. So on the right hand side here, you can see also a series of phrases that include the word dissemination. The workshops, the event, the book could imply one-way mode dissemination again, and we're talking about beneficiaries rather than benefits in a fairly vague kind of way. So both the qualitative and the quantitative analysis suggesting that that we need to the low-scoring ones are talking about the pathway rather than the impact itself. Compare now the implicit magnitude of, say, the UK government or the Prime Minister or a select committee compared on the right-hand side to the North or a city council. And you can see instantly specific jurisdictional reach, the UK, the US, for example, compared to non-specific, the North or nationally, internationally, and a difference in magnitude in both cases. Second of the 2 findings is, well, great, I think that I've got a specific high magnitude claim, but if I can't link that effectively back to my research, I've got a problem. So in the qualitative research, this was done well, by and large, in the good case studies. In the poorer case studies, there were these leaps of logic or gaps in causal chains at least 50% of the time. In the policy case studies, we're more likely to see policy plus implementation in the high scoring ones. The graph that you can't see so clearly on my slide, you can see very clearly in the paper, is from section 5, corroborating sources, that shows that in the low scoring ones, the issue here is we've got vague and or poorly linked corroborating evidence. So we need to have clearly a list which is numbered and linked to specific claims. We want to actually highlight what it is that this thing is showing and whereabouts in this very long document the evidence might be, for example. And what we don't want is a big long list of undifferentiated URLs, for example. Or worst case scenario, it's a fairly embarrassing table in our paper which includes someone saying, if you just contact this generic customer service email address, then they'll corroborate my impact for me. Most importantly, though, having looked at the quantitative analysis at the bottom of the screen here, on the left-hand side, you can see attribution between the research and impact shown through all of these attributional phrases. I'm going to mute everyone. Great. So, oops. On the left-hand side, first of all, you can see that there are many more attributional phrases in the high-scoring corpus compared to the low-scoring corpus, more than you can see on the slide here. And if you just immerse yourself in these, you get a sense of the causality from one thing to the next. We did scratch our heads for some time over why there were these three attributional phrases in the low-scoring corpus. And as it happens, when you analyze the words before and after the attributional phrase, statistically speaking, on the left-hand side, in the high-scoring ones, you're more likely to see impact to the right of the phrase. So it was cited in the, and now we've got a policy document or something like that, an actual impact. By contrast, on the right-hand side of the screen here, in the low-scoring case studies, it was just as likely to be research informing more research, a pathway informing some research or another pathway, or maybe, just maybe, it was evidencing to an impact. So great, let's keep this attribution in here, but let's try and do this in a way that is attributing it to impact. Now, Bella also did a cometrics analysis on this, to have a look at the cohesion of the text. Two of these came out as significant with strong effect sizes. One was the use of logical connectives, things like and, or but, which you see a lot more of in the high scoring ones compared to the low scoring. But also a form of argumentative causation here, where this is coherent in terms of coherent arguments. So if I give you an example, you get a set of text with evidence, and you put it into this analysis as a note form in, say, bullets, you'll get a low cohesion score on this particular measure. By contrast, take that same information and turn that into a well-crafted paragraph of prose, and you will get a high cohesion score on that. So these are cohesive, well-argued texts which attribute from research and pathways to impact. The third point on the slide is around the research outputs and process. So there was a large number of phrases that you can see here that are about the research process that you only see in the low scoring corpus. There was only one word in the high scoring corpus that was in this category. And what we think is going on here is that people are just not answering the questions. So section 2 was meant to be about your research findings as they underpin the impact. And evidence of the quality of the research. Now, in Ref 2021, we're asked to put that evidence of research quality, 2-star or above, in section 3. So some indicators, ideally, underneath our list of research outputs, or perhaps some prose explaining why it meets the output criteria for being 2-star or above. But in this case, we're seeing a load of things which are neither of these things. It's not about quality or about research findings. We're just wasting space talking about process when we could have been using that for something else. A linked point to this, which a lot of people haven't realized, is that the word limits are indicative. So interestingly, if you look at the word limits in Ref 2021, they are the same as in Ref 2014, despite the fact that we have an extra page. Yeah, there's some additional stuff at the beginning, but we do have more space. The word limits are the same. And what I'm trying to do is to keep everything else as space efficient as possible. It's not just words, trying to cut out tables and other space wasting devices, so that I have as many words as possible for the details of the impact section 4. And that means that I'm potentially doubling my word count on section 4. And while you may feel uncomfortable about that because of the word limits, remember they are indicative, and the majority of universities are significantly going over the word limit for section 4, because that's, I'm going to argue, where the majority of your marks are going to come from. The final of our points is the most contentious, because this suggests that there was, in fact, an additional set of criteria that were unwritten, they were unpublished, and yet they were applied fairly consistently by the ref panels. And this is around style. Now, it was perhaps naive on my part. I think Bella was more savvy than me here. She expected this more than I did. I didn't think that this would come out as linked to scores, but there are a whole load of these that link to scores. Now, in the qualitative stuff, there's actually a lot of quantitative analysis ongoing that will be in Bella's thesis, but for this paper, this is just from the qualitative part of our work. We can see that the high scoring case studies use more direct, plain language, fewer expressions of uncertainty, heading statements, clauses, subclauses, the stuff of good academic practice, no less. We're seeing that being replaced by these kind of simplified, linearized narratives. And also less likely to contain unsubstantiated or vague adjectives, such as "it was transformational." The quantitative linguistic analysis then backs this up. Our corpus linguistics analysis suggests that we've got a whole series of phrases that you only find in the low scoring corpus that we're going to describe as academies, whereas you can cut that make it simpler to read and understand, which suggests either a lack of oversight and editing, or more worryingly, academics pushing back and saying, "I know best and I'm not changing this." So humility required, I'm going to suggest. Essentially what this slide suggests is that there was a new genre of writing that emerged in 2014 in impact case studies. The high scoring case study authors learned how to write in this genre. The impact case study, the impact officers in your institution, others from professional services staff in particular, are experts in this genre of writing. And we need the humility to say, you know what, I'm not an expert in how to write an impact case study. I get help, I take that advice. We also then, I say we, this is by and large, Bella applied the flash reading ease score to these and found that the high scoring ones were indeed easier to read, but I don't want to overplay this because the effect size is small. These significant differences are within the category graduate level reading ease. So these are technical documents for committees of people who have a lot of expertise. This is not about dumbing down. But yeah, making them easier to read, great, shorter sentences, words, etc. It's worth considering.
Just on that point of the flash reading use score, yes, don't overplay this, but the effect size was quite substantial in main panel C especially, and also in main panel D. So in main panel A, these were generally harder to read than according to this measure, than case studies from any other panel, and there wasn't really a difference between high and low scoring in main panel A. The way that this measure works, it measures sentence and word length, and this means that maybe if you have to use quite a lot of technical terms, I don't know, thinking of maybe pharmacy here, this will affect the score. But also it measures sentence length, so it can tell you, actually, you've got a sentence here that's 4, 5, 6 lines, and that is harder to read. This measure is highly correlated with reading speed. So we can say that in 2014, the high scoring case studies were significantly, scientifically, statistically significantly faster to read. And I would like you to bear that in mind when editing the case studies at a later stage. And when someone says, oh, this is hard to read and I'm struggling a little bit here, try and make it as easy for the reader as possible. Within, of course, what Mark said, these are technical documents. Your readers are hopefully from your unit of assessment and will know what you're talking about, but just try and keep their mental load. Anyway, yeah, there's a question here, very pertinent. Does it make sense then when we do have to use technical words to frame these in shorter sentences? As someone reading loads of case studies now, I think, yes, it would help because you're just making it easier for them to process those technical terms. But don't read too much into that, but I would encourage you to do that. Also, this is a very common measure, and I think it's the one that powers the readability one in Microsoft Word, and there's loads of checkers in the slides that I can also, I might actually just send the slides around, my slides around via the chat later on, because it includes all those hyperlinks to the places in the paper, but also a hyperlink to this tool that we used, which spits out that measure. So if you've got, especially maybe if you're an impact professional, you might read a paragraph and think, wow, this looks really, I'm struggling with this one. And then you can just plonk that into that tool and it gives you the score, and then you can go back to your academic and say, actually, this is significantly harder to read than it should be, even for this kind of genre. I sometimes do that when I review this. I'm conscious of time and I'm talking a lot and passionately about this. So yeah, I will send my slides around in a moment. I'm just thinking, is there anything else we need to say slides-wise, Mark? Just check mine. Actually, I've got one more slide that or actually two more slides that I would like to share, if you can hear me now.
I'll stop sharing because we can hear you perfectly at last. So go for it, Bella. If you can share your screen. Your new headphones did the trick. You came in just in the nick of time to stop me massacring that last slide. Over to you.
All right. So there's here something on the use of adjectives. I think you may have said some of that already. Adjectives are especially powerful when they're used in third-party endorsement, and you just be very careful with overclaiming. I think I had a case study just yesterday that says the third substantial impact is, and I thought, your impact is A, not impact, and B, not substantial, so please don't use that word here. This sometimes happens. Right, so my summary slide. So take home points from all of our analyses and our experience of reading case studies for 2021. So one of the threats going through all of this is the need to be specific. What is it that has changed? Who benefits from this change? Why does it matter? Another one is to include these explicit links between the research and the impact, with evidence, not too much detail to distract from that impact. So once you have evidence that your role was significant, it doesn't really help to add further pathway related material. The question to ask is always, could that have happened without you? If the answer is no, then great. And you don't need to evidence that further once you have evidenced it. Talking about significance and reach, where reach is not geographically impressive in the context of that particular unit of assessment, it should be explained in what ways it is impressive. I had a conversation last week where someone said, but can I put the word international because international, doesn't it have to be international? And I said, no, it does not very much not have to be international to get a 4-star. It needs to be impressive in that context. And this can be a very local context if you reached hard to reach groups, if you reached basically everyone who could potentially benefit from this, even if those people are more locally clustered. So I'm trying to get away from this focus on international or even national reach. National, of course, it's great, but if you can say why it really matters that you have had this impact at this scale, and this is the largest scale that could potentially, where this could potentially be impact, then I can't see how they can visualize that. I mean, depending on how small the scale is, maybe it's not going to be a 4-star, but trying to shoehorn something into your case study just to make it international does not, is unlikely to be convincing. And then finally, case studies should be easy to read, easy enough to read at least, with causal and logical relationships made visible. Another top tip now is rather than a take home. So those points have come out of our research of 2014 case studies. The next slide based on observations that I've made as a reviewer. One thing is to add dates everywhere for context. I also set an expectation. So I'm now getting something that says my audio quality might be low. My system tells me that.
Yeah, you broke up. Do you want to just summarize this last point quickly? And
I think you can see this on the slides.
Yeah,
I think they're self-explanatory at this point.
Great, but we got
back to you then.
End, so that's great.
Exactly, yeah.
Great. So Dave and Kat are asking, thanks for hosting, does evidence have to directly reference the HEI or researchers involved? For example, with a testimonial that says academic X helped develop product B and its impact, and then we have some separate material that suggests the product was effective, but the academic or institution were not mentioned. Could this be classed as evidence? And the key thing is here you've got a causal chain, so as long as all of those bits of the causal chain link up to each other. So in this case, I've got one bit that says, so the research led to the patent product, whatever that is. And then we've got additional evidence now from the product, which then has all these other benefits. It's the same with the policy. So we've got evidence, at least, that the research informed the policy. I don't need to have evidence then that all of the impacts of that policy are directly linked to the research in any testimonial or other evidence, because that link has already been established. So just make sure each link in that chain is properly established, and you can then build fairly long causal chains and talk to people who have no idea potentially that your research is at the other end of that long causal chain, as long as everything up until that point is clearly evidenced. So Bella, do you want to pick out one that you'd like to answer?
Yeah, I mean, there's one really easy to answer question, which is impact only measured in hindsight, or can you also be scored on intended impact? Unfortunately, it has to be retrospective, so it has to have happened already. Now, what does already mean? It doesn't mean by now, it means by the end of the eligibility period. As of today, the end of the eligibility period is the end of July 2020. However, as Mark said at the beginning, there is discussion about moving that deadline to the end of December this year. But until at least the end of May, this has to be guesswork, because it's only then that they will give us the outcome of the survey that's currently running.
Great, so I'm going to take a few questions together here. So someone's asking of examples of impact versus pathway. Someone else asking affecting the policy of an NGO, does that count? And someone else talking about participatory research where impact is quite localized. For me, the answer to all of these is context. There are certain kinds of impact that, depending on your perspective, are quite subjective as to whether or not they might be considered pathway or impact. So policy is a good example of this, because you could argue that, well, okay, we've got a new policy, but I've got no idea whether that policy is actually going to generate benefits for anyone, or potentially it's going to go badly wrong. Just look at Brexit as an example of this, and you have wildly different opinions about whether Brexit as a policy is going to be beneficial or not. So the fact that our research led to Brexit, God forbid, might or might not be considered an impact, depending on what then comes next. So you're trying as far as possible to always ask what happens next and what is the benefit. But the key thing is to use context to make it clear that this is actually really quite impressive. So for example, in the case of the NGO, I need to be able to explain why this is actually really important. So if you look at Cardiff University, Ref 2014 sociology, there was a case study which was very clearly tagged as a policy impact, but it was changing the policy of Job Centre Plus, and it got 4-star, we know that. And the reason it got 4-star was because they were able to show how actually when you change the policy of Job Centre Plus, that gets cascaded to how they do what they do across the UK, and then there are benefits of that policy. Fantastic. So it can be an organisational policy, that's fine. I need to then justify why that is actually really important. And ideally, you're going to have a look at what the effects of that policy are in some shape or form. But if not, it's all about the context. That's why it's an important organisation. It's the first time ever that they've had a policy like this, etc., etc.
There's another high-level question here. How have panels been instructed to deal with COVID-19 disruptions? Answer is we don't know yet, but this is being consulted on at the moment, if I understand things correctly. Another question. Will Ref 2021 be auditing samples of impact case study claimed evidence more than in 2014? I don't think we can answer that because we're not Ref panels, we can just guess. I would assume that they would not necessarily do massive amounts of audit, but this is just a gut feeling because they have said in the panel criteria that they are not really going to look, but really I'm not saying this on the basis of any kind of authority. So I don't know, Mark, if you've got any further intel on that, but I would assume that not.
Yeah, but I think while I would agree with you, let's make sure that everything does add up, because you never know what might be audited. And
absolutely, yeah. I'm not saying don't take it seriously.
Changing a quote in a favourable way in your case study, which doesn't marry up with the quote that's in your testimonial letter, might not.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
So talking of that, someone's asking if testimonial letters are needed, and no, they are a common form of evidence. The most common way in which evidence, in which rigour was demonstrated in evidence, was this idea of triangulation in REF 2014. So you see this again and again. There are a few case studies which are highly quantitative, say a regression equation, a model, or something like that. But typically you have multiple sources of evidence all checking this from different perspectives. And while you might argue that one of those is flimsy, when you've got 2 or 3 now interlocking, great, this looks credible, looks believable. And that may be from a testimonial or multiple testimonials, but it could be from a feedback survey, a report, could be from a bit of social science where you've quoted interviewees anonymously in your paper, for example, as long as you then give the link to that paper.
Yeah, so we've got a question that I think has been asked before and we haven't probably answered it, so it's been posted again. If there's a difference in terms of criteria for assessment, economy and commerce with quantitative. So I think I understand your question from Ali here to mean, are some kinds of impact more highly rated than others? And I think here, in theory, that shouldn't be, but it possibly also depends on the panel. And then I would say that the more specific you can make the evidence, the more specific you can make the claims, and the more specifically and possibly quantified you can evidence your culture and learning criterion, the more of a chance you stand that it will be viewed as similar in value, I think. So if you're in a discipline where, or if you have had impact where it's easy to quantify something, then great. But if that's not possible, then I think the challenge is to make that qualitative argument to say why it is so important that you did make that change. Yeah, I can see Mark bringing up the graphs from our article here. So this is from 2014. You can see which impacts were, which types of impacts, according to Mark's typology, were most represented in the different main panels. It's on page 8 of the PDF if anyone wants to check that out later on.
Great. So sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I've just seen Sam and Ishtar's question here. Can there be any refinements in the REF 2014 to 2021 in the distinctions between impact and pathways to impact? I think that also kind of ties in with the question from Stephen about NGOs and if there's pathways, this impact. Quite often you have something that could be pathway or impact. So I'm just going to switch on my camera for a second and hope that it doesn't break the audio. Because sometimes you've got, well, let's just stop. Sometimes you've got maybe your research at one end of the scale and you have a really nice and visible goal at the other end of the scale. Maybe your research is, I don't know what, and your goal is to improve attainment in math in A-level or something. And then your research does something that raises awareness in someone, that leads to policy change, that leads to change in practice in teachers, that then leads to outcome. Now, all of these pieces before that are technically, if you look at it this way, a step of the pathway towards the ultimate impact, which is higher attainment in math, which maybe again is also a pathway to then higher life chances for those people who will then go on to change the world because they can become engineers, whatever. You can probably, for most of these, extend this. Now, I would say the closer you get to the benefit that you could get to, the closer you get to something that is more impact than pathway, and the closer you are to something that is your research, the closer you are to something that's maybe pathway. But most of these pieces in between, for example, the policy and the change in practice, can definitely be claimed as impact. I don't know whether that really answers that question, but I've found that helpful to think about it that way, because then you can maybe it's not always follow-up question popping here, yeah, can funders realistically expect you to get those big benefits? Probably not, because attainment in math, again, that goes back to what Mark said at the beginning. The longer the causal chain becomes, the more parts this chain has, and the more difficult it is to link it back to evidence it back to your involvement. And of course, you can't say children are better at math just because of my research. There will be many, many more influences there. So that's, I mean, what I just explained is probably a very artificial construct. So you can then maybe, it can maybe help you to make the arguments, to clarify in your own mind where you sit, and then that can maybe help you to make the argument for the assessors. Just checking.
Good.
Yeah, there's definitely a degree of overlap, I would say. Yeah, thanks for phrasing it
here,
that way.
Guys. We need to just let people go who need to. I'd like to say another 10-15 minutes to try and answer as many questions as we can. So if you haven't had your question answered yet, and you have some flexibility in your time, please do stay, and I'll certainly need to get going in the next 10-15 minutes. I've got other calls to take, but let's see what we can do. I'll rattle through a couple just quick ones. There's a few people asking, in fact, let me do something on evidence actually, rather some of the minor ones. A few people asking about really difficult evidence then, cultural impacts from art, for example. Policy impacts, for example, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where there are hundreds of researchers. One thing that I'll do in the email that I'll send a link to a paper which is still under review, sadly. Rachel Blanche from Queen Margaret University, who's on the call, co-authored this with me and some colleagues from University of Leeds, on methods for impact evaluation, and in that a whole load of methods for evaluating cultural impacts, and interestingly most of the methods actually come from the arts and humanities, things that enable you to measure things that other methods from other domains would not enable you to do, in particular from implicit to explicit articulations of impact. So I'll put that into an email to everyone. And I think in terms of the policy stuff, it is hard, and nobody will expect you to be the sole piece of research that led to a policy. It does happen, but it's pretty rare, and it's not generally good practice. So the policy community, they are meant to be doing evidence synthesis across multiple bits of evidence and informing policy in that way. So they're not doing their job right if they base the policy on one single small-scale study. So you have to be able to articulate how this works in terms of your own input to this. So if you see the example I put on the screen earlier on in terms of my influence on that piece of funding through DEFRA, it came through the Peatland Code. The Peatland Code was in fact based on lots of different research, probably over 100 different bits of research. But because I led on the project that ultimately led to the Peatland Code, and my research was part of that, my colleague in DEFRA was quite happy to say that this was based on my research. In some cases, you'll get based on so-and-so's research along with other people's. And for the most recent budget announcement, I've got a testimonial like that that says there were others, but it included Mark's work, and Mark's work was important. It wasn't kind of a minor part of this. So the testimonial interview process helps to really articulate and give you a sense of what that looks like. I'm just thinking I might be able to give you another example of this, but Bella, do you want to take another question while I...
Yeah, I muted myself, but hopefully back now. I've just scrolled up and I've seen a question which I think we haven't answered yet. Is it likely that university response to COVID-19 could form an impact case study? I would, in principle, I think so, but I would need to know kind of more of what the background is behind that question. Should we start looking for ways to include responses to COVID-19 in any of our relevant impact case studies? I would say, sure, go for it. I mean, this is a situation that none of us chose, and most people are negatively affected by this. However, I've already seen cases where someone has adapted part of the impact to the new situation and has identified new problems that have arisen through, for example, the lockdown situation, and have, through their research and the partners they're working with, found ways to and if those follow from maybe some impacts that you're already evidencing, and you can adapt them, and which hopefully is after the end of the current situation, whatever that is, then I would say definitely, if you're doing anything now that could count as impact that is in response to COVID of any sort, especially in science, humanities and arts even, I've seen examples of that in all those that I just mentioned, so it's not just tied to main panel A. Then I would say definitely make a note of all those things, and remember that the submission date, which is different from the cutoff date, is likely to be at some point next year, at least probably up to 12 months from now. So you can always collect the evidence. If it, I mean, obviously it's a good idea to try and collect the evidence, but don't worry too much, I would say, about, oh, I can't include this because I'll never get the evidence by the end of July. I would say that goes some way to answering that question. Right, handing back to Mark.
So yeah, a linked question, I think. If impact is obviously seen and achieved during the course of the research, but it's not sustainable post-research, is that still considered as impressive impact? Well, certainly eligible impact. And for me, this is all about how you frame this and how you create the narrative. So the most common example I hear of this are companies that make millions, change the world, and then go bust. And there's going to be a few of those over the next year, I suspect. Does that mean you can't include it? Well, of course not, because during the course of that, when it was working, this is the amount of money that it made. Yeah, it lost it all, but it's still, that's still impressive economically. And let's go beyond this and see now what was the good that those products actually achieved. In terms of policies as well, we've got a new government, they've reversed that policy. Well, depending on the nature of the policy, 4 or 5 years, a whole load of people benefited from that. 4 or 5 years, this number of cars were taken off the road, and that is a net benefit to the climate, even if all those cars get put back on the road again once that policy gets reversed. So I think it would be disingenuous to imply that this has continued, but I would very briefly mention that, yeah, there's an end point to this, and not overplay that, and then really focus on what were the benefits during the relevant period.
How do you demonstrate that your research has reduced or prevented harm, risk, cost, or other negative effects? It's tricky. I don't know, Mark.
Yeah, so this
usually when I hit something like that, then I can kind of respond to it. But it's a very general question here, which I totally get. But if, you know, with an example, it's kind of easier to have ideas what to do about that.
So I think the thing that you need here is a counterfactual, and this is why it's hard to prove.
Yeah.
In theory, if we had done nothing, this is what would have happened. And it's very hard to prove beyond doubt that that terrible thing would have happened. So Two ways in which I've seen this being done is through various forms of modelling. So a regression equation that shows here was the trend, environmental degradation or increasing prevalence of a disease. It was a robust trend, and now that has been levelled off. And if the stats are robust enough, then perhaps you can make a strong enough argument it would have continued like that had we not intervened based on our research. A more sophisticated approach to this is using other forms of modelling, and I'm going to look at various scenarios. I'm going to look at the most conservative of those scenarios, do some sensitivity analysis on that, and now based on this more complex process-based model rather than just a regression model. I'm going to assess what we think are the likely impacts this would have had in the most conservative scenario had we not intervened. That would need to be, for me, in the peer-reviewed evidence, so we can actually see the workings of that model and check that that has been reviewed by qualified experts. But if done well and in the peer-reviewed literature, then yeah, that's the form of evidence I would look for to robustly provide the level of counterfactual needed to say, yeah, without this, there would have been some kind of disaster.
I've got a question about how do you present the evidence, Rachel, from Rachel. Are you asking here about the evidence that you put into section 5, or are you asking about something else? So
yes, section 5, that last bit where you just have, where they give you 7 or 10 spaces, and I'm wondering, is each testimonial letter one corroborating source? Can you put them into one little summary report of testimonials or feedback from beneficiaries, testimonials from stakeholders?
Okay.
Yeah, have you seen good practice on that?
Yeah. Okay. So to my understanding, but I'm happy to be corrected by people who are actually embedded in ARMA, which I'm not. So disclose list, unfortunately. To my understanding from the FAQs on the REF website, you cannot combine testimonials into one slot. I'm sorry for that. Each testimonial, I think, will have to be its own number here. It might be different for newspaper reports, I think, if I understand that correctly. I mean, it's quite vague. Have I seen best practice, Mark?
Yeah, so I've seen some different ways. So there is one official way around it, which is that if you frame those testimonials as interviews as part of a research process and then publish that, it might be a fairly low-level publication. But if I want to interview 20, 30 different people and pool stuff from across that, I can then cite that paper, which has 20 testimonials in it effectively. And that's one way around that, where you're safe with that, and I have seen that done.
So I think the closer we get to the submission date, the more difficult it is to go down that route.
Yeah, certainly in terms of a peer-reviewed article, it's going to become more challenging. Although I have to say, in terms of outputs, I was encouraged. I recently published in Emerald Open Research, and within 2 weeks, I had a DOI for my paper because it's an open peer review process. So open peer review journals, you can get a DOI within 2 weeks. And then the theory is going to be, it will be all the way through. And when the reviewers are looking at it online, at that point, it will have all the peer reviews in place, et cetera, et cetera. But the stipulation in REF is that you have a DOI. So that's one way around getting something in the peer-reviewed literature fairly quickly. You can create dossiers. So for public engagement case studies in particular, you're going to have potentially 5 years worth of schools visits, and you can put them into a single dossier and put that as one slot.
Yeah, I've just posted the text that I've copied from the REF FAQs.
Great.
About grouping multiple items as a single source to correlate the impact. In terms of your original question of how do you present the evidence, what I find helpful is to have a quick, a very short indication of what it is that this is corroborating. So if I hit a section 5 and I see loads of links and I don't know what to do with them, I don't know why they're there, that's not as convincing as if I have a section 5 where I've got a link saying this is the link to this document where my research is cited on page whatever it is. So not taking too much space, because by the time I hit section 5, I would assume that the assessors will have made up their mind already. The scores are, I mean, section 5 is not supposed to give any additional information that the review and that the assessor needs to make to give the score, but kind of to remind them why this source is here.
A linked question from Stephen McCulloch here. It's an indicative number of 10 corroborating sources. And I've not seen people going above this. People seem to be sticking to this fairly rigidly, but it does say indicative. So in theory is no reason why you couldn't go above 10 if you really needed to. But for me, that would be, yeah, I'm going to put in an 11th one because it's absolutely essential. But yeah, it's not something I'm seeing being done by people, but in theory, perhaps. Another question on the timing of things. A couple of people saying, what if your research comes out after the impact? That's fine, as long as you've got that DOI in before the submission date, which we're expecting probably maybe for March 2021 now. We'll see what happens with that. And certainly I've got 2 papers I'm writing for my impact case study that have not come out yet, which are underpinning my research, because we've been using the research as we go to generate impact, and that's fine. So almost finished, guys. I need to get going quite soon.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry, Mark. I'll just say that Lara has asked a question. I thought they changed it now from indicative to actual. Where has that come from? Maybe I've missed something here.
Yeah, interesting.
Could you possibly clarify on this one in the chat as well, maybe, while Mark wraps up?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to have a look at the ref guidance and get the official, the appendix version of the, if I can find it.
Okay, so it depends on what it, I mean, from what I've seen, both on the FAQs and elsewhere, is that the word limits are indicative, and that section 5 is also indicative, that it has to be no more than 6 references in section 3. That was my understanding. But as I said, I'm not, I don't have access to some things that impact officers officially have access to. So,
yeah, I've got the guidance up. I'm just looking for the relevant appendix, so I get this from the horse's mouth. There we go. 5B. Oh. That's not the actual. Yeah, maybe we have to come back to you on that one, because I want to know the answer to that as well.
Yeah, I certainly do, because I keep advising that it's, you know, that's indicative. I don't want to give wrong advice.
Yeah, it'd be quite handy. Here we go. Yeah, so according to the ref template in the appendix of the ref guidance, section 5, sources to corroborate the impact, brackets, indicative maximum of 10 references. So whoever wrote that, if this has been superseded by an FAQ that we've not read, that would be very useful to know.
I think for, I mean,
says,
sorry, Lara, I'm not sure whether your question was just about the section 5. That is in an FAQ, is saying that we expect that up to 10 references will be sufficient, though it's recognized that in some instances further references may be required. So for section 5, that seems to be fine.
So interesting. So Lara, you might want to go back to.
But I would try really very much not to.
Yeah. So Lara says our ref team said that based on the FAQs. There could be a misunderstanding on either of our parts there. So Lara, please refer.
All right. Okay. So maybe let's just back off on this one.
Because if we're wrong, we need to know.
Yeah.
Right. So Hannah's saying, I understood you could combine, for example, testimonials on the same point in one of these references. Yeah, so the FAQ seems fairly clear to me that you're not meant to do that. But it's kind of hard. I mean, in the kind of dossiers that you're going to have for a lot of public engagement, there will be multiple testimonials on visitor books, on online surveys, from schools' work, which you can quote, and you can have hundreds of testimonials all in a single dossier. But because they're not officially called testimonials on a letterhead, then you're allowed as many as you want in that. So yeah, there is grey area here, isn't there? And my sense is that where there's a will, there's a way. So whether it's combining your testimonials all into some kind of official publication and citing that ideally from the peer-reviewed literature, or legitimately they're part of some other kind of dossier. Have a look at the FAQs on that in terms of allowing you to have these documents that combine multiple sources. I think they gave media as the example of in the FAQ. But yeah, there is a grey area, and I can't see if you've tried to do that properly and it's integrated into a broader document, that they're going to make you unclassifiable for the sake of that, especially when, as we've said, it's an indicative maximum of 10. That's my personal view, and maybe that's a bit too risky for some. Anyway, time is up, I'm afraid. I've got to move to another call, but it has been a pleasure, and thank you, so many of you, for staying for the additional questions. I'm going to splice this together. I'm hopefully going to edit this in a seamless way so it looks like it was a perfectly smooth webinar with no technical hitches whatsoever. I'm going to, if I can, combine that with the question and answer session we had about a month ago with Bella. And we're going to do a repeat of this on the 5th of May. So if you want to join in the discussion again, do feel free to come on the 5th of May. And ultimately we'll have probably a fairly long video that will be on YouTube with all of these discussions, because different things come out each time. But I'll send something hopefully later today or tomorrow morning with links to everything, and once the video is prepared, I'll send that to you as well. Bella, thank you for putting up with the technical issues and for co-hosting this with me. It's been a real pleasure, as ever. Take care, guys.